Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Very
we can
well.
hear you,
Hello,
Alex.
Alex.
Yes.
Okay, nice. Good evening to you. Good evening to all the Duraners out there. I want to discuss two things today. The first thing is about Nord Stream 2, right? And I believe this point was already brought up by someone. I believe a gentleman in Canada a couple of weeks ago on this show. But the discussion all sort of trickled down to the Green Party in Germany uh, gaining traction. So the thing I want to ask is concerns contractual obligations of companies which pulled out of Nord Stream 2. And I was just wondering, are there no contractual penalties for companies who pulled out of the project in fear of being sanctioned by the US? Because if there aren't, well, it's a bit weird. I mean, you can argue that maybe sanctions could be a force majeure case for these companies, but I wouldn't argue that. I don't think it is like that. I mean, they entered the contract in good faith, and they should have delivered. And if they are not delivering, then Russia or the company or whatever company entity is building and commissioning this project on their behalf, they should be able to, sue them. Maybe they go to arbitration. They probably have, well, they should have an arbitration clause in London or to Sweden, and to, bring legal claims against these companies. So are you aware of anything in this regard?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been widely discussed and much talked about. If Nord Stream 2 is simply cancelled, the compensation claims that Gazprom and other Russian suppliers could make would be enormous. They would run into billions. And that's one reason, by the way, that why many German companies and investors who've been piled into Nord Stream 2 are very anxious to see it completed, because they don't want to be put in that kind of position. Now, if there are sanctions, if the United States, for example, were to impose the kind of sanctions that would make carrying out Nord Stream 2 impossible, yes, then I could just about see that a force majeure argument might just be sustainable. Still be difficult in legal terms, but I could still see how it might be. You could argue that we can't carry it through because even though we have contractual obligations to you, we would be put in such an impossible position by the United States that we have no effective alternative but to pull out. It would be a difficult argument, but I could just see it. But if you have a Green government come elected in September and they say, well, we're stopping Nord Stream 2 because we don't like it. We think it's going to do all sorts of damage to the marine life and to the environment and to all that kind of thing. Well, of course, in that case, force majeure does not apply. And at that point, all those compensation claims, which you're talking about, Alexander, will come into force and come into force with a vengeance. That's why, by the way, even if even if the Greens win in September, I think it is unlikely that they would end Nord Stream 2, because God help us, there would be all hell to play in legal terms. But beyond that, anyway, I think that they would need to form a coalition government with other parties, probably the SPD, possibly the FDP, conceivably even Die Linke, all of which, for various reasons, support Nord Stream 2. So I just don't think it's going to happen if the Greens win. And the points about compensation that you make are absolutely valid. I ought to say, by the way, that there is a court case underway in Germany at the moment, which has been brought by an ecological group, and they're trying to stop Nord Stream 2 on the basis that it's dangerous to the marine life of the Baltic Sea. This is despite the fact that the regulator has said that this isn't the case. I understand virtually everybody who is involved in that case expects the administrative court to rule against the ecological group. And in the meantime, apparently work on the project is still continuing. And the world being as it is, some people do wonder whether this ecological group is quite what it pretends to be, but that's another story. But there's still this sniping that goes on around the edges. And by the way, if that ecological group were to win, and if Nord Stream 2 were to be blocked for that reason, then of course all the compensation claims that which we've been talking about would absolutely apply, because in that case, obviously, a contract would have been entered into in good faith. There would be no question of sanctions, no question of force majeure, and at that point, you would be able, the Gazprom and its Russian partners would be able to bring all the claims that they wanted to bring with high prospects of success.
Yes, I do hope you are right, because for the sake of international commerce and legal certainty,
Yeah.
it has to be like that. Because when I was reading all these news about Nord Stream 2, I was just thinking, am I missing something? How can you just unilaterally pull out of a project like that with absolutely no penalty? And if they somehow escape liability, then this will set a very dangerous precedent where one country, specifically United States, can do all sorts of extraordinary things with the sanction weapon, allowing companies to pull out of projects here and there without any sort of penalty. This is detrimental to legal certainty and global commerce. This must not stand. They must, I'm not picking sides here. For the sake of legal certainty, you have to either deliver or pay the compensation and maybe the damages too.
Alexander, you're absolutely right, but I'm afraid I have to give you a cautionary note, because, of course, in Ukraine-related litigation, all those points that you've made absolutely apply, and yet things have worked otherwise. I mean, I'm sure you remember that there was a case some years ago where Russia loaned to President Yanukovych's government in Ukraine $3 billion. And Ukraine defaulted on that, and those that loan was secured through contracts made in England and supposedly enforceable in the English High Court. So the Russians brought a claim to get their money back, and it succeeded on appeal because it succeeded in the High Court because realistically there was absolutely no conceivable argument against it. And then Ukraine appealed, and the cold case has just got basically going nowhere because it seems to be bogged down in appeal processes. So that looked like a clear-cut case, and yet obviously politics, and I'm going to be straightforward about it, intervened. They didn't want to have Ukraine declared in default, because if it did, that would have stopped all the IMF funding, and they found a way of simply prolonging the case indefinitely so that Ukraine could avoid being in technical default and could receive IMF funding. And then there was another case when Gazprom brought a claim against Ukraine, and Ukraine over payment for gas deliveries, and Ukraine counterclaimed, and it went to the Stockholm Arbitration Court, and the Stockholm Arbitration Court decided on every conceivable legal point that was really at issue in Gazprom's favor, and then it still went ahead and extinguished Gazprom's award and said that Gazprom owed Naftogaz, Ukraine's company, money because these actions had somehow, because this was necessary to help the Ukrainian economy, which is legal reasoning I've never seen before in my life. So yes, all the points we've been making about Nord Stream 2, they are exactly as clear-cut as you have said. But unfortunately, the days when one could rely on courts in the West, the Stockholm Arbitration Court in Stockholm, the High Court and the Court of Appeal in England, and the Supreme Court in England, to apply the law impartially and put politics to one side, well, that doesn't seem to be quite the case any longer. I still think that with Nord Stream 2, it would be different, but who's to say?
Yes. Well, maybe we can write off Ukraine really as a basket case, because, money always enters Ukraine, but it never leaves, as it seems. Right. But I just hope that the Russians exercise and exhaust all the possible legal possibilities available, because it's just, it's if they don't do so, if they just sort of back off, which is really undesirable, it'll be reminiscent of the doping scandal a couple of years ago, where a lot of people, including in Russia, were pushing Russians to file a claim after a claim, including civil claims against all these bogus allegations, and they are really legally illiterate. The Russians, they might have a brilliant institution of diplomacy, but when it comes to legal matters, they're not really that skillful, and definitely not close to any other Western country, let alone the United States, who really are masters of litigation. They've got all sorts of legal levers available. So I guess the moral of the story is that when you're undertaking such a large project, $11 billion project, you need to have an option B, a legal option, a good option, so that things like these don't happen. You owe it to yourself, really.
You are totally right about what you've just said. The Russians are awful at this sort of thing. One of the reasons is that they don't have good commercial lawyers of their own. So in these sort of claims, and they tend to rely on Western, usually British law firms. And that is never a clever thing to do. Not because these law firms aren't, sometimes perfectly good law firms, but of course, if they're British, they come under all kinds of pressures themselves. So you're absolutely right that your observation is spot on. The closest analogy, by the way, I think one of the things that would give the Russians a strong position on Nord Stream 2 is that the Germans have effectively admitted that they would have to pay compensation if it was cancelled. So it's difficult to see how they would go behind that. But anyway, you had a second point, I think.
Yes, a second point, just another brief observation, and about all this censorship thing, and in the media and in social media about labels and stuff. I just think that it's getting a bit out of hand in a way that the concept of the concept of peer reviewing is basically being killed off, so that we have a designated person. Maybe he's a a certain tech billionaire we're all aware of, or maybe a company, or maybe a certain government, and what they say is official information. And it's not subject to peer review, right? It's because we've seen so many people. I've seen so many people who are, even doctors who are qualified people who would like to give their opinion on a certain medication or a certain situation and things like that, but they're getting immediately shut down on the grounds that they're spreading misinformation. So basically, can you imagine in perhaps a campus, in a university campus situation, or in just in university, for example, where you are not allowed to peer review someone in order to, first of all, peer reviewing also helps the person who is being peer reviewed, because this is you're helping them improve, because the person who is being peer reviewed, well, he's supposed to be always right. You're not supposed to point out that he's wrong, or God forbid you hurt his or her feelings while doing so. And I think that we need to value and preserve the concept of peer reviewing. That comes in a form of criticizing the government too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole situation is it's deplorable. I mean, look, we are particularly exposed to this sort of thing because of the sort of work we do. But all I will say is this, and I could say a lot more, but again, we have to be careful what we say, which is astonishing, even discussing this topic, especially discussing this topic. But I would never once have believed that in the United States, in Britain, in the West, we would find ourselves in this position. And here we are. I mean, I can't say more than that, but it's awful.
Yes, it's awful. Well, thank you for taking my call. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And until next time, I suppose.
Yep. Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much.